this week, Luis, we have an exciting announcement. We are really excited to announce that we've partnered with a great company called FTX. And if you're wondering, well, what is FTX? Basically, they're a safe exchange where people can trade things like cryptocurrencies, NFTs, and other digital assets.
New chaos in the world of cryptocurrency. FTX shocked investors by declaring bankruptcy this week. It spent millions making sure its name was seen and known.
They're regulated in the U.S. and other places around the world.
The big difference between cryptocurrency and the rest of the currencies that we are used to in this world is that there is no safety net whatsoever. There is no regulatory guidance.
It's important to find a safe, trustworthy place, and FTX is that place.
Obviously, the SEC, the CFTC now investigating FTX's handling of customer funds.
The safe and regulated place that you can go.
There's no regulatory oversight, no consumer protections, no licensure, no insurance, no net capital, no transparency, no sunlight. We have no idea what's going on inside of these entities.
And, in a wild world, especially a new one like the world of blockchain, that can be very valuable to know that this is a company that is going to stand behind their product and that you can trust is going to do the right thing.
Search warrants, arrests, all of those things are going to happen very quickly. This is worse than Theranos. This is worse than Madoff.
We can't recommend them highly enough.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Lucky Paper Radio. I am Andy, and I'm here with my co-host, Anthony, the Wolf of the Cube community, Maddox.
I don't get it.
I feel like you're like a fixer of random...
that
wolf.
Okay.
The Pulp Fiction wolf.
Okay, sure, yeah. I was just thinking about Pulp Fiction the other day.
What were you thinking about it?
I just had the what does Marcellus Wallace look like just stuck in my head.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so yeah, what do? Why am I the wolf?
I feel like if there's a small problem to be solved with technology in the Cube community, you oftentimes crop up to fix that problem. I'm talking specifically about the, whatever we're calling it, the list maker, the tabler labeler, the tool that you...
kind of like Codex Shredder. I think that's a cutesy name that you came up with.
I am so loath to just name a magic thing after a card, because that's what everybody does. That's everything. And I feel like it's hard to remember those things often, because you're like, I know it's named after a magic card, but I don't remember which one. And so it's not very memorable either. I can't bring myself to just be fully on board with that. But it does make sense. You could also go with Ledger Shredder, though. I feel like that one is
it's
more...
not really shredding the ledger. It's kind of doing the opposite. It's pro ledger.
But it is shredding the codex.
Yeah, that's true.
The shredder is the consistent part.
That part is the same.
I think the problem is that Ledger Shredder is like a more in the zeitgeist card.
Sure, yeah.
So it would be more confusing to call it that Codex Shredder. I mean, some people listening probably don't even know what Codex Shredder does. It's like they never built a Lantern Control EDH deck like I did that one time. Boy, was that a mistake. That was awful. That was not fun magic.
You had a good time with it.
That was when I learned that I think the worst card to play with in Commander is Telepathy. It's just awful. It's like, what if all of the hidden information was gone and this became instead a puzzle of don't mess up. Hey, don't mess up, because you know all the information. So if you mess up, it's on you.
I think one of the meanest I've been to somebody in a game of Magic was when they played Telepathy. I feel
was it me?
No, it wasn't you. It was somebody, some rando.
This was like 6 years ago.
Yeah, this was years and years ago. Some rando at an LGS. And the issue was, I think this was, they drew a bad second 7 and they ended up mulliganing like 6 times. And everybody was like, yeah, I guess just take another mulligan. And they just kept doing it.
And then they did turn one
and
Telepathy
at the end,
after
they were
all
so
that?
excited. They were like, oh my God, I get to play this card. I'm so excited about it. And they were so excited.
Boy.
Turn when they played Telepathy, and I'm just like, buddy, you just ruined this. Like, I was it's just straightforward. I was like, that card sucks. That's ruined this game. Like, I am not going to be able to keep track of all of this. And I immediately just like completely made mistakes and couldn't keep track of everything, all the information that was there. And it was just, I
can forgive people for thinking it would be fun, because I really enjoy the attitude towards Magic that's like, I'm going to take this card that is kind of bad, that does a weird thing, and try and have fun with it. The problem is that you can't actually have fun with Telepathy. It's impossible. There's no fun to be had.
Hidden information is a really, really important part of what makes Magic fun.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, what if you just replaced every draw set with a Demonic Tutor? There's a card that does that, right?
Yes, I think because it just had some weird interaction with some new card that spiked it. Some legend from Lorwyn, I think.
And you don't want to remove that variance either. Oh, every single draw step, go and find the exact right card in your deck and don't mess up. Hey, look, get the right one. Don't screw up and get the wrong one. It's not fun. You got to give yourself a little bit of leeway. The variance allows people to hide their poor skill, me so included. The variance allows me to hide my poor skill in variance. I can be like, well, I simply didn't know that or didn't draw the correct thing. It's nice to have that.
I mean, this is related. Scapegoat. Isn't it terrible when you keep a sketchy hand and then your opponent thought seizes you and you're just like, oh, now you have to know about this hand that I kept?
I don't know how this is, but I feel like I'm always on the other side of that equation. I'm the one always duressing or thought seizing my opponent and them going, oh no. I concede, so you don't see my hand. Concede is a special action in response.
That's all mountains and black spells. That's what I chose.
I will also say that I think I may be more likely to mulligan more hands than I should than keep a suspect hand. I think my heuristic falls on the other side of that, where I'm like, oh, 5 lands, I can do better than this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I definitely don't mulligan
sometimes I
enough.
Can't, and I should have not mulliganed. So, by our powers combined, Anthony, we
make one person.
Statistically, our mulligan decisions are perfect.
Perfect.
Without flaw.
Anyway, yeah, I do like to solve problems with software.
You took a big deep breath in, and I thought you were going to try and do a segue, but then you just called back to your nickname.
A callback. It's like a segue in terms of the rhetorical devices of podcasts.
Anyway, if you have a magic problem out there that involves a list of cards, get in touch with Anthony as he continues to work on the Codex Shredder. Ugh.
We got so much stuff. I need to fix
if you have a better
issues
name
with the cube map. I need to fix a bunch of issues with this scratch pad, which I'm actively using to record this podcast. It's too much software.
These are pretty small issues, though.
Okay.
All things considered.
Sure. Yeah, let's...
I mean, I love Cube Cobra, but there's some pretty big issues on Cube Cobra right now, so...
That's another thing I could be doing, is contributing more to Cube Cobra. I did one tiny, tiny little feature there once.
It was a really good feature. I really appreciate it. But I think we can't just talk about your software this entire episode. Though I do want to say, if someone has a better name for the thing that just allows you to format a table of cards with various information, it's like the most nerdy, detail-oriented, data transformation-y tool. If you got a better name for that thing, hit us up. It's hard to name things. So we're not going to name things in this episode. Instead, Anthony, we're going to talk about the new mechanics from Magic's latest set, The Brothers' War, and give our first impressions of those mechanics and how they might interact with Cube, because that is the format that we love the most. You did pre-release last night, correct?
I did.
I was traveling out of town. I have not yet touched a Brothers' War card. What are your first impressions of having played the set presumably in 4 matches so far?
So, obviously, there's a lot of recency bias in this, but I think it might be one of my favorite sets ever immediately. I think this set is super, super cool.
I, just looking at the mechanics, thought it would seem like a really cool set because we'll get into the details, but overall, the set seems to be about artifacts and graveyards.
Yep.
And I feel like if you were to look at some of the most popular themes that people tend to design their cubes around or design their environments around, I think artifacts and graveyards are 2 of the most common ones, partially because they are broad enough, they kind of touch any kind of thing, and they're flexible enough to be paired with really any other type of mechanic or strategy. That flexibility is really nice, but also because I think it's just something fundamentally fun about reusing your resources in your graveyard and having this access to that as a live zone instead of just your discard pile. And there was something great about artifacts being largely colorless, though this set obviously has a lot of plays on that particular part of that effect. And being able to kind of fit in any deck also provides a lot of flexibility in the draft. So I can see how this would be a particularly fun set just right out of the gate.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's something about just the graveyard very much representing sort of the whole structure of the game, and it's this resource that builds up over the course of a game that really lets you highlight and visualize sort of the long-term strategy of a particular game of Magic that makes it really fun. And like you say, yeah, just everything can touch the graveyard in a mechanical sense. If you have just like creatures naturally go to the graveyard, but it can be used as a resource for things like Delve. And if you end up discarding stuff, you can have other cards that interact with things in the graveyard or just mechanics entirely built around it. There's so many ways that you can just have stuff that works with it. So yeah, there's a lot of space for cool decision making there.
Also, in a more broad sense, I've been teaching a new person to play Magic lately, which has been fun. I like to do that every once in a while, just bringing them into my hobby. And it's always fun watching somebody realize for the first time that, oh, that card I use is not actually just irrelevant and gone forever. Like, there's something about knowing that you have Graveyard Matter stuff in your deck, even if it's just a little bit of it, that every single spell you cast, you're like, that could still be relevant. I could still use that later on. I feel like that feeling is a nice part of why Graveyard Matter stuff is so fun.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very natural experience that a lot of players have with all kinds of games. When you discover something that seems like a downside or a negative can actually be turned into an upside is just a really cool and exciting moment.
let's just dive into these mechanics then. We're going to go over them in the order that the official Mothership article goes over them. We'll put that article in the show notes, obviously, so you can see the official explanations of these mechanics there. Anthony, our first mechanic is Prototype. This is a new ability found just on artifact creature cards that basically allows you to cast the artifact creature in 2 modes. You can either cast it for the regular cost in the top right, as you would expect, or there is a little kind of rules text box within a rules text box that allows you to cast the creature for its prototype cost, which in all cases in this set, the main mana cost for these creatures is a colorless value, and it's a higher number, and the prototype cost is a colored mana cost with a lower mana value. So basically you're adding color and paying a cheaper cost, and you get that creature with all the same abilities, just with a different power toughness text box. So really modal creatures where you have a big version and a small version, abilities remain the same, but for different mana costs, you get different combinations of power and toughness. Every mechanic is kicker, Anthony?
I was going to say, we're just going to talk about this particular set's 3 variations on kicker. This is a little bit different than kicker, though. I mean, it's obviously a lot different.
I appreciate that they really leaned into the aspect of this that can't be done with kicker, namely that the cheaper cost is the one that has colored mana value.
Exactly, yeah.
Obviously you can imagine, I'm looking here at Phyrexian Fleshgorger, which I think is maybe the most flashy of the prototype cards, and this has a regular mana value of 7 generic mana, or a prototype mana value of 1 black. So you could imagine making a card that was 1 black for this 3/3, or you pay a kicker of 4 and you get a 7/5, but you can't pay for that mana cost with 7 green, which you can, of course, do with Phyrexian Fleshgorger. So I feel like they've leaned into the one thing that makes us a little different from kicker, which is that the larger mana value mana cost is actually much less restrictive.
Right. I mean, one of the things I really love about this set, in addition to just, even with the tiny bit of experience I've had with it so far, it being very fun to play, is the fact that it is this top-down design where they had to solve these really weird problems, and I think they did it in a very cool way. So one of the things they wanted to do is just make this set be all about artifacts, because that's what the story was about. It was about Mishra and Urza digging up all these weird Thran artifacts.
2 tech bros just
just
throwing tech at each
burning the
other.
world down. Yeah,
it's basically
really
just Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg.
Yikes. Anyway, so they also really wanted to lean into the fact that those artifacts were colorless in the story, and at that time in Magic, I think, as well as at that time in sort of the timeline of the history of the multiverse and the fiction of Magic. But they know they have this issue that if you put a ton of colorless cards into a set, they can end up just in a lot of different decks, and you sort of lose some of the diversity in terms of deck construction.
Right. If all these prototype costs were also just generic mana value and had no color associated with them, then a huge part of drafting and deck building would just be, take the most powerful cards.
Right,
because
absolutely.
we lose, I think we talked about in the last episode, the value of the color power. We lose this additional force that is pushing us to choose specific combinations of cards instead of just playing the most raw powerful ones.
Yeah. So the fact that they figured out a way to say, this looks like a colorless card, it's a classic artifact, but there is still, in terms of a mechanical sense, this kind of weird restriction. And I kind of like the way that plays out as well, that you can technically put these cards into a deck that doesn't have the whatever the color is for the prototype version.
Of course.
But to really optimize them, you do want that. So it's a cool level of modality. And it honestly kind of just makes sense in a way, because it's okay, I want to be able to play this in my black deck. I'm usually going to play it as a 3 mana card. If I can get to 7 mana, it's okay, whatever. You've got 7 mana. Who cares what colors you have at this point? You're good for it, right?
From a cube design perspective, I really like that. I mean, again, my first impression of these cards was great, kicker, but more complicated. Mm-hmm. Pew! Super duper. Then I thought about it more, and I think from a cube design perspective, it's really interesting that these are kind of like split cards in that they are either, in most cases, this Phyrexian Fleshgorger is a 3 mana 3/3 with these abilities, or it's a cheat target for your green ramp deck,
right,
or a cheat target for your Goblin Welder deck, or a big ramp target if you have a big artifact ramp deck with Metalworker and a bunch of mana rocks or something. And in that case, you can actually just ignore the black part. I'm never planning on doing that. I just need another Tinker target. And so now I have one, and it didn't take a whole slot in my cube that otherwise would just be dedicated to this pure, narrow cheat payoff, because this card is normally a black 3-drop, and now it's also sometimes this sort of Tinker big artifact payoff, which I think is a really cool layer for cubes that do have big ramp decks, artifact cheat decks, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, and even just if you're thinking in like a more fair kind of reanimator, this is just more likely to get into the graveyard as a big thing. If it's just like a thing you cast on 3, maybe it trades off with something, or trades off with 2 things because it's got Menace, and then it's just a big thing in the graveyard if you want to reanimate or unearth it or whatever you're going to do.
Yeah, this mechanic does have a couple of interesting synergies with reanimation effects. Like you play it as a cheap creature, it dies in the course of normal combat, but you reanimate it as a big creature. Also with blink effects, if you ephemerate one of these cards, you cast it for its cheap cost, blink it, it enters the battlefield again as its main mode, the much bigger, more powerful creature. So it's got some cute shenanigans you can do there. And overall, I think the mechanic is going to play really nicely. It's not without criticism, though. First of all, I think the cards look a little bit janky, to be honest.
That is my one criticism as well. The frame is... It's not the most elegant looking.
Yeah, I mean, I think it effectively communicates what they need to communicate. It's effective, but I don't think it's particularly beautiful, which may matter to you or may not matter to you. My bigger complaint is I think there's going to be memory issues with these cards because when the card is in play, there is no indication of what mode it was cast in.
So I see what you're saying, but I think that, and that's definitely something that crossed my mind as well, I think that's going to be less of a problem than it seems like it's going to be, specifically because when you're playing a game, you sort of have the whole context of that game, the history with it. I agree if you're just like looking at a random board state, that could be a problem. But if you're looking at your opponent's board state and they have less than 7 lands in play, or, they do have 7 lands in play, but you remember this Phyrexian Fleshgorger has been in play for 6 turns, it can't be the big version. I'm talking myself in the other direction because then I'm just reflecting on everything we just said about, reanimation and blinking and all these kinds of things. So yeah, I think it's there. I think that it's definitely limited in like standard. I think it's not going to be as much of an issue, but maybe in some cube environments where it's just like this is this one random prototype card, that could be more of a problem.
Yeah, I think it is in the same category as like it's a little thing. You're not going to miss it 95% of the time, but every once in a while there will have been some big board that was complicated and there was some big shift in that board and now it's like, actually, was that? And you'll be able to work backwards and figure it out. It's probably never going to be like totally devastating, but those are the little things that add up that make Cube really complicated and make it, that in combination with 10 more small little things that you said would be easy to track mentally, is what makes it difficult to play a game of Cube, more likely for you to make a mistake. And so I think it is a downside for me, a moderate downside, but overall I do still really like the cards and like what they bring to the table, because I do love modal effects, and I don't actually have any cubes that I think would benefit from both sides of the sort of split card effect that I described, where it's either a cheat target or it's a colored card. Because my cubes that want the cheat target are like the degenerate micro cube, and there it's like you don't care about the prototype cost. Casting fair creatures is not really on the menu, and I don't have any cheat strategies in my main button magic cube. So I'm really actually more excited for these for other people's cubes, for cubes that do have Welder, Tinker, Channel, big artifact mana, that kind of stuff. I think that's where these cards are really going to shine and allow people to have slots do double duty in their cube design, thus making picks a little less prescriptive in decks that otherwise maybe have a little more required real estate in a cube in order to be viable.
Yeah, something else they've done with these cards I think is pretty cool that differentiates it from a lot of these other sort of classic mechanics is because it's this creature that is going to have one text box but is going to be multiple different sizes, a lot of these creatures have effects that care about the power or toughness of that creature. So, for example, the Fleshgorger, it has ward based on the creature's power, which just means if you cast it for the full cost, you also actually get a better ability. Or another one that I think a lot of people are going to be excited about is Arcane Proxy, which lets you buy back an instant sorcery based on its power. And that's going to change depending on which half of it you cast. So it's cool to see, here's a text box that's going to be the same for both sides of this card, but it's going to function a little bit differently.
Yeah. I mean, for example, a way I think this would be a little more elegant in terms of board state, like if the prototype cost said, you can cast this creature for the prototype cost. If you do, it enters the battlefield with 4-1/-1 counters on it or something. That would be different in some ways, obviously. I'm sure they didn't want to put -1/-1 counters in the set for a variety of specific reasons to this set, but I think I would prefer that just for the legibility of the board, right? Like, you just get this thing, it's got those counters on it, and there's some indicator that, like, this was cast for the cheap mode as opposed for the expensive mode, but I don't know. The grand scheme of things, I think it's important. It's one of these small things that we talk about a lot being relevant, especially as they accumulate and you have a lot of small things in your cube like that, but it's not going to stop me from testing these cards, or the ones that I'm more interested in.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing they could have done, obviously, is double face cards, but boy, am I glad they didn't.
I'm glad it's not a double face card. I will definitely say that.
So the next headline mechanic for the set is Powerstones. This one's pretty simple. It's just a new sort of trinket artifact token like we've had with food and blood and clues in the past. We now also add Powerstones to the list. It's an artifact token that has tap, add 1 colorless mana. This mana can't be spent to cast non-artifact spells. So it can still be spent on artifacts, and it can also be spent to activate any kind of abilities.
Yep, regardless of whether that ability is from an artifact source. So
right, exactly.
It's essentially a little mana rock. You're making a little... What is the canonical colorless mana rock? We have Mana Lift for producing colored mana. Is there a canonical
I usually
shorthand?
Think of Mind Stone, but there's got to be
but
just
that one's so good because you can cycle it. Who knows? It's a little token that can produce colorless mana, but with those restrictions, which I think are going to be pretty substantial. This mechanic to me seems like a great mechanic for Artifact Matters cubes, because if your cube cares about artifacts, obviously then you can use that mana from those Power Stones to cast a lot more spells in the cube than you would otherwise be able to cast in a cube without an artifact theme. But also more importantly, making artifact tokens oftentimes matters in cubes that care about having a density of artifacts, even if you don't necessarily plan to get the most mileage out of tapping that artifact for mana. We see things like food, blood, treasures matter just because now your artifact count is 6 artifacts on board. If it turns on Metalcraft or whatever, it does a thing in your Artifact Matters cube that is outside of the actual rules text, the function printed on the token itself.
Yeah, I almost think it could just say, you could have a card that just says, make an artifact token. And that would still be very cool. Like, the fact that it has some application sometimes, I think, makes it make a lot more sense.
It reminds me of, like, How to Keep an Is It Mage Busy, right?
Sure, yeah.
That mystery booster card that just puts itself back in your hand and does nothing. It just is a cast spell trigger. If you had, like, has artifact token would be... I mean, I think you could make that mechanic. It's the kind of thing that'd be confusing to, like, really new players. They'd be like, what is this? Why do I care about it? But that mechanic could absolutely exist, and you could definitely develop cards around the marginal value of just adding an artifact to play.
Yeah, and I feel like this is actually a little bit similar to Decayed Zombie tokens, which also felt like kind of bad. It was like, this is a lot worse than a regular zombie. These are a lot worse than clues, a lot worse than food in most contexts, but the fact that it just is this resource that you can use now is super cool, and it actually feels much more reasonable to use that resource. I definitely had a lot of fun making Power Stones and sacrificing them to draw cards yesterday, and I think it's going to be a cool feature of this set.
I do think people are going to, because the rules text of this token has a restriction, they're going to think, oh, this is bad, because I can so clearly see an alternative world where it was a mana lift token or whatever, and think that it's just bad because there is a restriction on it. But like you said, that restriction allowed them to print cards that aggressively produce Power Stones at a rate they would not have been able to do if it was producing mana lift tokens, because it would have been broken.
Yeah.
And so it's another balancing mechanic that we see this all the time in sets when a mechanic is worded to sound somehow like a downside or a restriction, people tend to rate it more low than if it didn't have to be worded that way for whatever reason.
It's also cool that it has a couple different ways that it can be used. You can use it as this sort of resource in a deck where you're going to be sacrificing them for value, or, care about having a lot of artifacts on board. It can also be used as, described and just cast a bunch of big artifacts. So it definitely has that aspect as well, where if you're building an environment specifically about big artifacts, you can use them as intended as well.
So I think this is really going to appeal mostly to cube designers with cubes that care about artifacts in some substantial way. I think outside of that, the restriction is going to be annoying. Like, if you don't have a big artifact theme and you're mostly making that token just to say has artifact for some random card that has that, or to activate abilities or something, I do think you're going to feel that more. And these cards are probably not balanced for cubes that are not playing an artifact theme, given the restriction on Power Stones, is my guess for the most part. But if you are playing an artifact theme, I think that it's very appealing, and it does allow you to have both sides of that coin. Like you said, like, you can use it to actually cast big spells, which means that you can afford to have this sort of ramp strategy woven throughout whatever the rest of your deck is doing, because these cards that produce Power Stones also do other things, right? They're not just producing Power Stones.
Yeah, another aspect, though, about the balance that you mentioned is, if you look through the set, there are a ton of cards that have really, really expensive activated abilities. Things that cost
like
7
big mana
or
sinks,
8 big mana sinks, which I think makes sense in the set, because you're going to have a bunch of these Power Stones sitting around, so you can actually maybe get to those effects pretty quickly. But that might just mean that a lot of individual cards in a cube environment just might not make as much sense, even if it's like, oh, here's this geology enthusiast, and maybe it'd be cost at 3 mana to draw a card in a normal set. Here it costs 6 because you're expected to have a bunch of Power Stones. So that might mean that a bunch of individual cards just, have wildly different sort of power levels in different contexts.
It also gives us more just raw material of cards that have mana sinks. I love including a certain density of cards with mana sinks in my cube so that we really strongly avoid the both players are top decking and it comes down to whoever draws the best cards kind of game state, and having places to sink your mana is very valuable. It's one of those things that has decreasing value as you scale up the density, though, because what you really want is most players to have access to a mana sink in a game, because the second mana sink is not worth anything unless it's better than the first one, and the first one was worth nothing, right? You only need the one mana sink, generally speaking, and so I like to have a little smattering of those across all the different strategies and all the different colors in my cube, and this will provide more options for more cubes that want some sort of mana sink, even if they are perhaps a little overcosted relative to what they might be in a set without Power Stones.
One other note on the complexity is I think that is really going to come up when you have a lot of spells with alternate costs or things like Unearth, things that come out of the graveyard. A lot of those things you would look at and be like, okay, this card either could be written as an alternate cost or it could be written as an activated ability, and the Power Stones are going to work for those abilities but not for the alternate costs, which that's where I think it might get a little bit tricky sometimes, so something to be aware of.
Yeah, and on that note, Unearth is back in this set. Unearth is an activated ability, Anthony, not an alternate casting cost, so you can pay Unearth costs with Power Stones, even if the Unearth thing is not an artifact, though I think in this set, everything with Unearth is an artifact. Just as a reminder, Unearth is an activated ability that can be used from the graveyard, and it allows you to put the creature back into play, give it haste, and then exile it if it would leave play or at the end step, basically. You can't really save it. It goes away pretty much all the time, except for very rare weird edge cases. Here we see a couple new interpretations on Unearth. The first is Unearth has been introduced on non-creature artifacts. So previously Unearth was only a creature ability. It made sense that you would unearth a creature, it would get one attack or one activation of its ability, and then go away again. Now we have Unearth on non-creature artifacts. All of these non-creature artifacts have some sort of activated ability. I think they all require tapping as part of their cost, so you can get kind of one shot at that non-creature effect one last time. We also see, I believe for the first time, all colorless cards with colored Unearth abilities. So similar to the prototype cards, these are on cards that are colorless mana costs for their front side, and then the Unearth ability is a colored mana cost, which I think will play differently than prototype, partially because of how these cards are designed. They're not all really expensive necessarily on the front side, though many of them are. This is, I think, a good example of, we've talked before about how much we enjoy having these kind of subtle motivations to maybe splash a color that don't make a card fully gold, where it's only playable in a specific two-color deck or two-color combination. And I think many of these cards in certain environments will be playable even if you ignore the Unearth part, and then that Unearth becomes a kind of upside, like the off-color kicker costs or the off-color spectacle cost on Rick's Mighty Reveler, a card we've talked about before and really enjoy.
Yeah, I think that's similar to prototype. This is just an awesome way for them to make a bunch of colorless artifacts that look like colorless artifacts, but to really optimize them, you do need that particular color. It does kind of work the opposite way, that the first thing you do with it is going to be colorless, so it's a little bit easy to get this into play the first time, and then you get the second half when you actually have the right color to cast it, which I think it's just going to play well in a lot of contexts where you still want to be able to play your cards, and then later in the game where you have access to more colors of mana, you'll be able to use the Unearth cost. But I think that just will work much in a different way that's just a lot smoother, where I feel like the prototype cards in most contexts I think are going to be colored things. You're going to want the access to those colors, and you're going to want that access quickly in the game. Here you have a little bit more flexibility in the way that things play out.
And we see a mixture of Unearth costs that are cheaper than, the same cost as, or more expensive than the front side of the card. So unlike the prototype cards where there's a very clear pattern, the front side of all the prototype cards is an expensive colorless spell, and the prototype cost is a lower mana value colored cost. Here the Unearth costs are kind of all over the place. There's less of a pattern to be identified.
Yeah. Something else that's cool is a lot of these cards, they've stapled like enter the battlefield or attack or death triggers on it. So not only are you just unearthing a creature to get one more attack in, often you're unearthing it to get some extra ability too, which is very cool.
I think Unearth is cool as a mechanic. I like it. I think it's clean, and it allows for some like explosive plays. I love haste as a mechanic, honestly. I think haste is a very, very cool effect that allows you to kind of sequence things in these explosive turns that make for fun and dynamic games. And being able to have a haste card in your deck that doesn't always have haste, in most cases doesn't have haste, but still will allow for these really explosive moments, I think is pretty fun. It's also fun, I think, with the Unearth cards to think about discarding them for value. If if you don't ever plan to cast it, you get to use your Faithless Looting style effects and loot them away and then cast them out of your graveyard. So I think this is a great mechanic for cubes of all kinds, and having all of these new Unearth cards is going to be just great ammunition for cube designers.
Yeah, I mean, definitely we looked at some mechanics that will be very linear, and you definitely want a sort of critical mass of that mechanic to make them work in a context. These Unearth cards really don't require anything special. You can take whichever ones on the card-by-card basis make sense for any particular environment. They will likely work, and they work with a lot of other things. So like you're saying, if you have some looting, some discard, some cares about artifacts, some cares about death triggers or graveyard size, there's so many opportunities for these cards to work with other mechanics. And I think I might have a new favorite Magic card among these Unearth cards. Maybe we should save it for next week's episode, but I really, really adore one of these cards.
Let's tease it.
Okay.
You can tune in next week for our second part. I guess I didn't even do the whole introduction to what we're doing here. This is the first of 3 set review episodes where we go over the mechanics and give our first impressions. Our next episode next week will be our personal cube inclusions. So in the context of our own cubes, what cards we're excited to play. And then finally, we will be... I didn't even talk about the survey either. You gotta be on me when I'm not good at hosting this show. You gotta start being critical.
Put on the notes next time.
And then the part 3 of our 3-part set review will be a community review where we review the results of our survey, which is out now. So if you're listening to this and you have a cube, go to luckypaper.co/survey/BRO or check out the show notes for that link and fill out that survey and tell us what you are playing in your own cube so that we can give a broad impression of what's happening across the cube world as a whole. And in that time, Anthony, I'm going to try and guess what this card that you like so much is of the Unearth cards. There's only 20 to choose from, so I feel like I've got a decent shot.
I think you have a great shot.
Because I can rule out a number of them pretty quickly, so... But you can play along, listeners. See if you can guess what card is maybe Anthony's new favorite Magic card, which is a big statement.
I mean, it doesn't resonate with me in the same way as a lot of my favorite cards, but it's just a card I look at and I'm like, I want to put this into every single one of my environments.
Tune in next week. Find out if you're right.
So the last sort of headline mechanic that we have here is Meld. So this isn't a huge part of the set. There's actually only 3 pairs of cards which have Meld, but it's...
And they're all at Mythic Rare, correct?
They're kind of a mixture. Mythics, Rares, and I think even Uncommons is one half of Urza. But the way that this
one half is always Mythic Rare.
Sure.
So you can't possibly meld a thing without having at least one Mythic Rare in your pool.
I didn't see anybody meld at the pre-release yet. A couple people had just one half of a meld card, and they were really disappointed.
Yeah.
So the way this works, this is actually a returning mechanic from...
Shadows over Innistrad.
And the way it works is...
Or maybe Eldritch Moon. I think it was Eldritch Moon. Shadows was the one that was previewing it, and then Eldritch Moon was when Eldrazi actually arrived. So that's when we get Brazilla and... the rats and the
rats are cool.
And the Handweir battlements.
Township is amazing. Yeah. So the way that this mechanic works is we have 2 paired cards that on the back face each have half of a card, and you assemble them
extra
into
large
one
card.
Extra large double card, which is super cool and splashy. But in a lot of cubes, how do you think this is going to function?
Well, we don't see many of the Meld cards from Eldritch Moon see play in most cubes because it is pretty difficult to draft both halves of these cards, get them both in play, and they all have some condition that needs to be met in order for them to flip as well. Sometimes you pay a cost, sometimes you just have to have them both in play and get to your end step. There are different terms by which they flip. It's not a inherent part of the mechanic. It depends on the specific design of the cards themselves.
Right, so among these 3 pairs, one of them is a static ability. You have to have a certain number of lands in your graveyard and also have these 2 cards. One of them is attacking with the 2 cards at once, and the other is just an activated ability. If you have both, you can meld Urza into a giant planeswalker with 5 abilities and a static.
I have seen some cube designers do draft packages, so very often, I haven't actually evaluated these Meld cards individually yet, but in Eldritch Moon, it was the case that oftentimes one half of the Meld pair was pretty aggressively costed and playable. I'm thinking Gisela and Handweir Garrison. Mm-hmm. And then the other half was maybe a little less appealing, and so I have seen cube designers put the more appealing, more aggressively costed half of the Meld pair in their cubes and basically say, if you draft this, you will get the other half of this Meld pair for your deck construction if you want. That's definitely an option. Outside of that, I do think it's going to be pretty rare to be able to draft both halves of these, and I wouldn't be excited about putting a Meld pair in my cube unless both cards were individually worth inclusion on their own, and maybe that Meld thing happens once in a blue moon, but I think it's going to be rare to find a cube that is balanced just right where you're happy to have either half of these Meld cards as a completely standalone card in your cube.
I could see it, though. I mean, that would be super cool, and I think that if the sort of baseline of the two individual cards you're melding both make sense in your environment, so it's going to be sort of a case-by-case basis, then having that opportunity for every once in a while somebody's going to be able to draft both and flip them would be very cool to see.
I will say that this is not my favorite mechanic for obvious reasons, I think, but there's
there's a reason they only made 3 of them in this set. It's
right.
Not like a huge thing that's going to be present all the time.
But there's something to be said for the fact that, like, we both, I think, still remember the time you did assemble Brazella in your sealed pool, and it was amazing.
It was amazing, and probably still lost.
I don't think you lost. Having a mechanic that only comes up every once in a while does make it a lot more special, right?
Yeah.
Like, there's a strong criticism of some mechanic. Like you mentioned, people have half of the Meld card in their pool and just feel bad they don't have the other half and have no chance of doing it. That's going to happen a lot, I think. Even if you put these in a cube, it's going to happen a lot unless you do the draft package thing. But the fact that it's a thing that does happen very rarely means that it retains that air of specialness. It's just it's way more cool to do it because it doesn't happen that often, and you get to put this splashy extra large magic card on the battlefield, which is pretty fun. So I will not lie, I have definitely dreamed of putting Brazella in an environment, but it is never aligned with all of my other various cube design goals, so it is yet to happen. That kind of does it for the named mechanics in this set, the mechanics that Wizards actually reviews in their article about the set. But there's other things going on here that I think are worth talking about. We already touched a bit on the graveyard matter stuff in this set, and there is quite a bit of it. There's a lot of graveyard recursion. I think we've seen an uptick in size limited graveyard recursion, which I really like. So we have the equivalent of like reanimation spells, but we have an Unearth style effect where it cares about mana value as opposed to just getting back some giant creature, which definitely makes the mechanic more about value and less about combo, which traditionally reanimation spells, Reanimator as a strategy is very often a combo deck. Here we see more kind of scaled versions of this effect that can only bring back smaller things that make it a more toolbox value-oriented effect as opposed to a combo effect, which I think is a great direction to take it. And we also see a decent bit of mill going on here, both as self-mill if you want to mill yourself, which obviously fuels your graveyard, fuels your own graveyard synergies, and a little bit of things that can actually mill your opponent too, which can also be a theme. And obviously in a set where everyone's deck is going to care about the graveyard, mill becomes extra dynamic because it potentially makes your opponent's deck better, their hand better if you mill them, but you also get them closer to being milled out, so it's this cool kind of tension. I think that having more access to cards that fuel the graveyard, care about the graveyard, return stuff from the graveyard is just a net positive for the cube world as a whole, because again, these mechanics I think are so broad and universally applicable that a lot of these cards I think are going to see play in a lot of cubes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think every set to some degree plays in that space and does something with the graveyard. But this really does go deep. It's almost 50 cards that care about the graveyard in some way. I think in addition to the cards that actually, reward you for using the graveyard is a fair number of cards that interact with your opponent's graveyard. This sort of stood out to me as I was looking through cards, like, why is this exiling things from the graveyard or putting things from the graveyard in the bottom of the library? And it's just because there is a lot of stuff that cares about the graveyard and you want to have some interaction for it. So I think having access to both more graveyard synergies, but also more graveyard interaction in especially ways that aren't totally all or nothing is a really good tool to have access to. Every set we see a little bit of tribal these days, which I think is cool. That
wasn't always true, right?
I mean, Tribal's always been a big part of Magic, but I think they've definitely sort of hit a structure of limited formats where there's always like one or two tribes sort of sprinkled in, which I think is cool. In this case, we have...
As opposed to whole tribal sets, which historically have been kind of hard to get, especially the limited play of those sets right. I think the last time we had a truly tribal set was like Rivals of Ixalan, right? Mm-hmm. It's been a minute. I think it is maybe a more sustainable, better approach for them to kind of sprinkle a little bit of tribal into every set, but never so much that you get that kind of on-rails drafting effect that we see in a lot of limited sets that go deep on tribal synergies.
Right, so here we have soldiers in blue and white and a little bit in some other colors as well, and I think all that really means is if you're drafting a blue or white deck, every once in a while you'll have one or two of these additional sort of payoff cards for soldiers, and that'll just change the way that you'll prioritize things a little bit. Another sort of cool tweak on it is, even though soldiers are a popular tribe, we've seen lots of both, just soldier cards and things that care about soldier in the past. All the soldier tokens in this environment are artifact soldier tokens.
Yeah, that's new.
So I think that's a cool way to sort of bridge these soldiers with other sort of artifact and token synergies.
Yeah, that's the first time we've seen that token, and, obviously caveat about a million different tokens, and here's another different 1/1 soldier, but this one is more meaningfully different than the ones that are human or not human. Yeah. And it will matter, right, for gameplay a lot more than the human or non-human ones will. Though that does come up, especially with like mutate cards, which is one of the reasons I think we see people, especially down on mutating cube, is because did my Elspeth produce a human soldier or a regular soldier? I have to go reread and check, and oops, I can't mutate onto it, which is a kind of a feel bad. In addition to all these mechanics and themes, we also have a new cycle that I think is going to be really appealing to cube designers, Anthony, and that is a new cycle of monocolored commands. Commands are modal spells that give you 4 options, and you always get to choose 2 from, which is, again, just a very specific... That's what command has come to mean in Magic, the same way that edict has come to mean target opponent sacrifices a creature, much to your chagrin.
Yeah, it's a weird thing. Very much not descriptive or intuitive, but that's part of the Magic language.
If you're making a command...
You know how when I make a command, I give you 4 options, and do some of these things.
It makes sense that commands are spells,
yes,
as opposed to ongoing permanents or something, so that makes sense. And then the fact that you're a type of leader that makes like 4 different types of decisions, and I don't know. Look, that's what it's come to mean, so just accept it. We've seen these cards since Lorem is the first example of these, where we got Austere Command, Cryptic Command, those sorts of cards, and we've gotten others since in other sets, and here we return again to monocolored commands. These tend to be pushed in terms of their mana value and effect, so I expect these cards to be pretty good, which means they're going to appeal to a lot of people. And also, just cube designers tend to like modal cards for a lot of reasons. We talk a lot about modality on the show, but giving your players options allows them to maybe flex their strategic muscles a little more and make more meaningful decisions about what effect they want at this point in the game, as opposed to being stuck with whatever card they happen to draw, which obviously it's not that simple, but modal effects can be very appealing to lots of different cube designers, so I expect these to be somewhat popular.
Yeah, something else that's cool is, even though I'm often a little bit down on modal cards just because it's not very resonant, it's sort of just like, here, pick some of these options, it obviously does give you great sort of gameplay options, a lot of choice and agency, but in addition, I think a lot of these commands will often be meaningful in the things that you choose and the order they happen in. So, for example, in Titania's command, you can make tokens and then put counters on your creatures, and critically, the things happen in the order of the cards, so you get to choose and sort of structure what the spell is going to do based on the choices you make.
And that's why we would never, for example, see like a textless promo of a command. That wouldn't make any sense, because it's so important to remember not just the modes, but the order totally matters. They would never do a thing like that.
No, that would be ridiculous.
Yeah, exactly. Anything else you want to talk about?
I think that's pretty much it. I mean, there's obviously a lot more cards in the set that do a lot of things. We see a lot of typical effects. Prowess is back, and +1/+1 counters. Spells matter, all very cool. There's even a couple cards, we talked about the 3 Meld cards. There's at least 4 cards that care about drawing your second card a turn, which I think is a cool mechanic that kind of overlaps really nicely with a lot of those spells matter mechanics. So yeah, even though these are kind of the headlines, there's definitely going to be a lot more here for particular environments that have particular interests.
I didn't tell you this, but friend of the show, Bones/Lucky Looter, was nice enough to organize a draft of the Amakar Desert Cube while I was in Oklahoma. So I got to go draft the cube with Bones and some members of his local play group. And I got to play with Fairy Vandal, which is a card that I love every time I get to play it. And every time I play it, I think, should I put this in the Bun Magic Cube? Like, it feels so good when I get to play it in other environments. And obviously other environments are different contexts and different power levels, but that card is so fun to play with. And I had a great time playing that cube. It's a really well thought out, very cool cube that we've talked about in the show before, and we'll link again, but people should check it out if they haven't.
Damn, I'm jealous.
I know.
Can't play more cube.
Next time, when you go to Oklahoma to visit our friend, then you can hit up Bones and make it happen.
But yeah, I agree about Fairy Vandal, and I actually kind of like that mechanic altogether, just because it sort of forces players to structure and sequence their turns a little bit differently.
I did a lot of main phase Fairy Vandals in my deck because I happened to have ways to draw cards at sorcery speed, and it was like, or ways to only draw one more card, which obviously wouldn't be drawing 2 cards in my opponent's turn, so I just had to main phase that flash creature. I agree. I love this kind of effect. This, to me, is in the same sort of category as the things that trigger when you cast your second spell. It's like you already want to be drawing extra cards. So designing cards that reward people for doing a thing they already want to be doing, already want to be multi-spelling, already want to be drawing a bunch of cards, it just kind of makes for this fun snowballing kind of gameplay, but not snowballing in a bad way, because it's not...
It's controlled. It's not just going on its own. It's not snowballing. It's not rolling down the hill on its own. You need to keep fueling it and figuring out the way to maximize
what I mean
that
is that if you reward people for doing a thing that is already good, sometimes the game state can kind of snowball in that player's favor. And I don't think most of these cards I don't think are that kind of pushed. They're not going to like claw you back from being behind in most cases, but it's just cool to have triggers that trigger on stuff that you want to be doing already. It makes for some real feel-good play patterns.
For sure. So yeah, I mean, overall, I'm really excited about this set. I think that for some cubes, this is going to be a tremendous set where there's ton of colorless cards. I mean, let's talk about the Devoid cube that's going to get so many new cards from this
I know that Dan is going crazy on Twitter about that cube, so...
But even if you're not really focused on any of these themes that this set is really all about, I think there's still just going to be a ton of things that could be applicable just because those are really open and flexible mechanics.
Yeah, I haven't gotten to play with the cards yet, but I'm excited about a lot of these mechanics, and I do think that just Graveyard Matters and
artifacts
tend to be very appealing to lots of cube designers, and for good reason. So I think this set will definitely be a big deal for people that have cubes that specifically focus on those things, and I think most cubes will still find a couple gems in there, even if they're not. That's it for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. As I said before, but not early enough, I should have said it at the beginning. Tune in next week for our personal cube inclusions episode, and then maybe the week after that, maybe a week in between as we process the survey data. We will have the community review coming to you. In order to have your voice heard in that community review, make sure you fill out the survey at luckypaper.co/survey/BRO. Another good opportunity, Anthony, to remind people that you made a fantastic tool, again, Wolf of the Cube community, you made a fantastic tool that allows people to pull up their past survey responses and have it automatically show them which cards they're still playing in their cube, show them their old rating, show them how cards have aged in their cube or not, which is a really, really cool tool we've gotten a lot of positive feedback on. So if you have answered previous surveys and you haven't checked that out, do check it out. It's very cool. And if you have not answered previous surveys, you should start answering them now so that in 6 months you can use that tool and look at your inclusions for Brothers War or whatever cool tool we build next and get all the advantages of that.
Yeah, it is really cool to sort of have that retrospect and even like look back at your comments about what you were thinking about a set and how your approach to your cube or approach to particular cards has changed. And as we say on the survey, all of that data is public. So if you want, you can even go search for somebody else's surveys and figure out how
you told it. You told them.
I think they figured this out as well. It's just a text
Some people
box.
did. Now more people are going to figure it out. Yeah, all the survey data is public in a lot of ways. So you can search Anthony Maddox and see what he said about past cards. Don't search me. All my answers are perfect.
I mean,
you don't have to look it up to know.
Yours are much more reliable. There's even, I put a little histogram there, which shows you, based on your rating, are the cards still included? And yours, it's got more green on the right side.
It does trend up that way. There's still an embarrassing amount of red in the threes, because the whole point of a three is that you're supposed to not cut it.
Yeah, you're not supposed to cut those threes.
Anyway, check out all those tools, check out the survey, and tune in next week to hear us talk about the cards we are personally most excited about for our own cubes. That's it for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. The show is produced by us reading about the mechanics of the new set, Anthony going to pre-release just for the content, just to help him talk about it on the podcast, and then sitting down in my basement and speaking into microphones. Thanks for doing all that, Anthony.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited to go do more pre-releases. I guess just for the content, not because I enjoy Magic the Gathering.
Yep, just the content. Content grind.